As the last notes of Claire de Lune faded into silence, Maria felt a surge of confidence she had never experienced before. The beautiful Steinway piano seemed to be responding to her every emotion, bringing out sounds she never knew she could create. The audience was completely quiet, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence from before. This was the kind of silence that happens when people are holding their breath, waiting for magic to continue. Maria glanced up at the crowd and saw faces that had completely transformed. The bored expressions were gone. The checking of phones had stopped. Even the waitstaff had abandoned their duties and gathered at the edges of the room to listen. She realized she had their complete attention, something she had never experienced in her 3 years of working here. But now came the real test. She was about to attempt something that even she wasn't sure she could pull off. Maria had been saving the most challenging piece for last, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult and emotionally powerful compositions ever written. Victor Petrov was famous for his interpretation of this piece, and Maria had spent countless hours learning it from watching his performances online. The concerto was meant to be played with a full orchestra, but Maria had learned a solo arrangement that captured the essence of the original. It required technical skill that pushed even professional pianists to their limits. For someone who was entirely self-taught, attempting it in front of this audience was either incredibly brave or completely foolish. Maria positioned her hands over the keys and took a deep breath. The opening notes of the concerto are gentle and melancholy, like someone quietly telling a story of great sadness and hope. As she began to play, she thought about her own story. The little girl who had fallen in love with music at a broken piano in a community center. The teenager who had taught herself by watching free videos online. The young woman who practiced every night on a keyboard with missing keys. The music started softly, but Maria could feel its power building. Rachmaninoff had written this piece during one of the darkest periods of his life, and it told a story of struggle, loss, and eventual triumph. As Maria played, she realized she was telling her own story through his notes. In the audience, Dr. Elena Whitmore sat transfixed. As the director of the city's most prestigious music conservatory, she had heard this piece performed by some of the world's greatest pianists. But there was something different about Maria's interpretation. It wasn't technically perfect. Elena could hear small mistakes that a trained ear would catch. But the emotional honesty in the performance was extraordinary. Next to Dr. Whitmore, tech billionaire James Chen found himself completely absorbed in the music. He had attended hundreds of classical concerts over the years, usually as a social obligation rather than genuine interest. But this young woman's playing was reaching him in a way that polished professional performances never had. There was vulnerability in her music that made it impossible to ignore. As Maria moved into the more complex sections of the concerto, her fingers flew across the keys with increasing confidence. The broken keyboard in her apartment had taught her to play with passion rather than perfection, and that passion was pouring out through every note. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, carrying the audience along on an emotional journey they hadn't expected to take. In the back corner of the room, world-renowned conductor Roberto Salvetti stood with his mouth slightly open. He had discovered many talented musicians over his 40-year career, but he had never seen anything quite like this. Here was a young woman with no formal training, no professional experience, playing one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire and making it sound like she had lived inside the music her entire life. Maria was now completely lost in the performance. Her nervousness had melted away, replaced by pure joy. This was what she had dreamed about during all those lonely nights of practice. Not just playing music, but becoming one with it. The piano felt like an extension of her own body, responding to her thoughts before she even moved her fingers. The concerto builds to an incredibly demanding climax that requires both hands to play rapid, complex passages simultaneously. Maria's hands moved across the keyboard like they were dancing, hitting every note with precision she didn't know she possessed. The music filled the grand dining room with power and beauty that made several people in the audience wipe tears from their eyes. As she played the final sections of the piece, Maria could sense the energy in the room reaching a peak. People were leaning forward in their chairs, completely captivated. Some had their hands pressed to their hearts. Others were openly crying. The music had created a connection between everyone in the room that transcended social class, wealth, and background. When Maria struck the final, powerful chord of the concerto, the silence that followed was profound. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The last notes hung in the air like something sacred that nobody wanted to disturb. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. It was Dr. Whitmore, rising from her seat with tears streaming down her face. Within seconds, James Chen joined her, then Roberto Salvetti, then the charity organizer. Like a wave spreading across the room, the entire audience rose to their feet. The applause started as a gentle appreciation, but quickly grew into something thunderous. These wealthy, sophisticated people who attended the finest concerts and cultural events around the world were giving Maria the kind of standing ovation usually reserved for world-class performers. The sound echoed off the walls and ceiling, seeming to go on forever. Maria sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had never received applause before, let alone anything like this. Tears began rolling down her cheeks as she looked out at the crowd of people who, just an hour ago, hadn't even seen her as a real person. Now they were celebrating her like she was the greatest pianist they had ever heard. Tony stood near the stage in complete shock. In all his years in the restaurant business, he had never witnessed anything like this transformation. The disaster of the evening had somehow become the most magical night in the restaurant's history. But Maria wasn't quite finished. As the applause began to die down, she remained seated at the piano. She had one more song in her heart, something that wasn't on Victor Petrov's original program, but felt perfect for this moment. She began to play Hallelujah, but not the way most people know it. Maria had created her own arrangement of the famous song, turning it into a piano piece that captured both its spiritual beauty and emotional depth. Her version told the story of finding something sacred in the most unexpected places, of dreams that seem impossible until suddenly they're not. As the familiar melody filled the room in this new, beautiful form, the audience realized they were witnessing something truly special. This wasn't just a good performance or even a great one. This was the moment when a hidden talent revealed itself to the world, when years of secret dreams finally found their voice. The silver-haired woman in the third row turned to her companion and whispered, "This is how stars are born." Maria played the final notes of Hallelujah with gentle reverence, letting the music fade into a silence that felt full of possibility. She had poured her entire heart into this performance, holding nothing back. Whatever happened next, she had given everything she had to give. The applause that followed was even longer and more enthusiastic than before, but this time Maria was ready for it. She stood up from the piano bench, smiled through her tears, and took her first bow as a musician rather than a server. In that moment, everything changed forever. The applause seemed to go on forever, but eventually it began to fade as people slowly returned to their seats. Maria stood beside the piano, still trying to process what had just happened. Her legs felt weak, and her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. She had never experienced anything like the rush of performing for a real audience, and the feeling was overwhelming. As the crowd settled down, Maria started to walk back toward the kitchen, thinking her moment was over and it was time to return to her serving duties. But before she could take more than a few steps, Dr. Elena Whitmore approached the stage with tears still glistening in her eyes. "Excuse me, dear," Dr. Whitmore called out, her voice carrying across the room. "Please don't leave just yet. I need to speak with you." Maria stopped, confused and a little nervous. She had no idea who this elegant older woman was or why she wanted to talk. The rest of the audience turned to watch this unexpected continuation of the evening's surprises. Dr. Whitmore climbed the few steps to the stage and took Maria's hands in hers. "My name is Elena Whitmore, and I'm the director of the Metropolitan Music Conservatory. What you just did was absolutely extraordinary." Maria's eyes widened. She had heard of the conservatory. It was the most prestigious music school in the state, where only the most talented students were accepted. The tuition alone cost more than Maria made in 2 years. "I don't understand," Maria whispered, still holding Dr. Whitmore's hands. "You have a gift," Dr. Whitmore said, loud enough for others to hear. "Raw talent like yours is incredibly rare. I've been teaching music for over 30 years, and I've never heard anything quite like what you just played. Your technique needs refinement, yes, but your musical soul is already fully developed." Before Maria could respond, James Chen had approached the stage as well. He was a tall man in his 40s with kind eyes behind expensive glasses. "I'm James Chen," he said, extending his hand. "I run the Chen Foundation, which supports arts education around the world. Dr. Whitmore is absolutely right about your talent." Maria shook his hand, still feeling like she was in some kind of dream. These people were talking about her music like it actually mattered, like she actually mattered. "I'd like to offer you a full scholarship to the conservatory," Dr. Whitmore continued. "Room, board, tuition, private lessons, everything you need to develop your gift properly," the audience murmured with excitement. Even in this room full of wealthy people, everyone understood what an incredible opportunity this was. Full scholarships to the Metropolitan Music Conservatory were almost unheard of. "And I'd like to provide additional support," James Chen added. "Living expenses, a professional quality piano for practice, anything you need to focus entirely on your music education." Maria felt dizzy. Just 2 hours ago, she had been a waitress worried about paying her rent. Now these strangers were offering to change her entire life. "I don't know what to say," she managed to whisper. "Say yes," called out a voice from the back of the room. It was Roberto Salvetti, the famous conductor, who had made his way to the front of the crowd. "Young lady, I've been conducting orchestras for 40 years and I know talent when I hear it. With proper training, you could be performing with major symphonies within 5 years. The charity organizer, who had been watching this entire exchange with amazement, suddenly stepped forward with a huge smile on her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the crowd, "I think we've just witnessed something truly magical tonight. And Maria, your performance has inspired the most generous response we've ever had at one of our events." She gestured toward the donation table, where people had been quietly writing checks throughout the conversation. "We've already raised over $2 million tonight for children's music programs. That's more than we've ever raised in a single evening, and it's all because of the heart and soul you put into your performance." Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. $2 million? For kids who loved music just like she did? Kids who might never get the chance to learn properly unless someone helped them? The thought that her music had inspired such generosity made her start crying all over again. The next few hours passed in a blur. Maria found herself surrounded by people who wanted to talk with her, to encourage her, to offer help and advice. A newspaper reporter who had been covering the charity event asked for an interview. Someone from a local television station wanted to film a story about her. A talent agent handed her a business card and talked about recording contracts and concert bookings, but through all the excitement, Maria kept thinking about the children who would benefit from the money raised tonight. She thought about her younger self, practicing on that broken piano at the community center, dreaming of having real lessons but knowing her family couldn't afford them. 3 months later, Maria was living in a small apartment near the conservatory, practicing 6 hours a day on a beautiful grand piano that James Chen had personally selected for her. Dr. Whitmore had been right about her needing technical refinement, but she had also been right about Maria's natural musical gifts. Every day brought new challenges and new discoveries about what she could accomplish with proper training. The story of her impromptu performance at the charity gala had gone viral on social media. Videos of her playing that night had been viewed millions of times, inspiring people around the world with the message that talent can emerge from anywhere, that dreams don't have to stay dreams forever. But Maria never forgot where she came from. Every weekend, she returned to her old neighborhood to volunteer at the community center where she had first fallen in love with music. Using the donations from that magical night, they had purchased new instruments and hired qualified teachers. Maria worked with kids who reminded her of herself, talented, passionate, but lacking opportunities. She also continued working 1 shift per week at the Grand Metropolitan, not because she needed the money anymore, but because Tony had become like family to her. The restaurant had become famous as the place where the server who became a star had been discovered. and Tony never tired of telling the story to new customers. A year after that life-changing evening, Maria gave her first professional concert with the City Symphony Orchestra. As she walked onto the stage in an elegant black dress, she looked out at an audience that included many familiar faces from the charity gala. Dr. Whitmore sat in the front row, beaming with pride. James Chen was there with his family. Roberto Salvetti had flown in specifically for her debut. But the person who meant the most to her was her mother, sitting in the center section with tears of joy streaming down her face. Maria's success had allowed her to quit one of her jobs and actually enjoy watching her daughter perform, instead of just worrying about making ends meet. As Maria sat down at the concert grand piano and prepared to play, she thought about the scared young woman who had untied her apron and walked toward a piano 18 months earlier. That woman had no idea that following her heart would lead to all of this. The education, the opportunities, the ability to help other young musicians, and most importantly, the chance to share her love of music with the world. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play, knowing that every note carried the dreams of that waitress who had refused to let fear keep her from the piano bench. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the biggest dreams come true when you finally find the courage to pursue them. The little girl who had fallen in love with a broken piano had finally found her voice, and the world was listening. Every step toward the stage felt like walking through thick mud. Maria's legs trembled with each movement, and her heart hammered so loud she was sure everyone in the restaurant could hear it. The dining room, which had been buzzing with disappointed conversations just moments before, began to quiet as people noticed the young woman in the server uniform walking toward the piano. Tony was still at the microphone, trying to reassure the restless crowd when he spotted Maria approaching from the corner of his eye. His face scrunched up in confusion. What was one of his waitresses doing heading toward the stage? This was definitely not the time for staff to be wandering around where they didn't belong. "Maria, what are you doing?" he whispered urgently as she passed near the microphone stand. "Get back to your tables. We have a situation here," but Maria didn't stop. She couldn't stop. If she paused even for a second, she knew her courage would disappear completely, and she would spend the rest of her life regretting this moment. She walked past Tony, past the confused stares of the wealthy guests, and straight toward the beautiful Steinway grand piano. The conversations in the room died down to an uncomfortable silence. 200 pairs of eyes followed this unexpected figure as she approached the most expensive instrument most of them had ever seen. Some guests exchanged puzzled glances. Others pulled out their phones, perhaps thinking this was some kind of strange performance art they didn't understand. Maria reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, looking down at the pristine black and white keys. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them still. The piano was even more beautiful up close than she had imagined. The keys seemed to glow under the stage lights, and she could see her own reflection in the polished black surface. Behind her, she heard Tony's panicked whisper, "Maria, please, whatever you're thinking, this isn't the time. These people are expecting a professional concert." She turned around and looked at the crowd. Faces stared back at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance to complete bewilderment. These people had paid enormous amounts of money to be here tonight. They had come expecting world-class entertainment from a famous pianist, not whatever this was. In the third row, she noticed an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, who wasn't looking at her with judgment like the others. The woman seemed genuinely interested rather than upset. Next to her sat a younger man in an expensive suit who had put down his phone and was leaning forward slightly, as if waiting to see what would happen. Maria realized she had to say something. She couldn't just sit down and start playing without any explanation. These people deserved to know who she was and why she thought she had any right to touch that piano. She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke. "My name is Maria Rodriguez. I work here as a server." Her words echoed through the sound system, sounding strange and small in the large room. The crowd remained silent, but she could sense their confusion growing. A server? What was a waitress doing on stage at their exclusive charity gala? I know you were expecting to hear Viktor Petrov tonight, Maria continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. I know I'm not a famous pianist. I'm not even a professional musician, but I've been studying his music for years, and I know every piece he was supposed to play. Someone in the back of the room actually laughed, not meanly, but with the kind of nervous uncertainty that comes when people don't know how to react to an unusual situation. Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she pressed on. I learned to play piano by watching videos online because my family couldn't afford lessons. I practice on a broken keyboard in my apartment after work every night. I know that probably sounds ridiculous to all of you, but music is the most important thing in my life. The silver-haired woman in the third row nodded slightly, encouraging Maria to continue. I can't promise I'll be as good as Viktor Petrov, Maria said, her honesty cutting through the awkward atmosphere. But I can promise I'll play with everything I have. And maybe, just maybe, we can still help raise money for those kids who love music as much as I do. She stepped away from the microphone and sat down at the piano bench. The moment her fingers touched the keys, everything changed. The smooth, cool surface felt perfect under her hands, so different from the plastic keys of her old keyboard. This was what a real piano was supposed to feel like. Maria closed her eyes and tried to block out the 200 people staring at her. She thought about all those nights in her tiny apartment, practicing the same pieces over and over. She thought about the broken piano at the community center where she had first fallen in love with music. She thought about every dream she had ever had about sitting at a piano like this one. She began with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and challenging pieces in Viktor Petrov's planned program. The first notes floated through the room like gentle raindrops, soft and delicate. Maria's technique wasn't perfect. Her fingers sometimes stumbled over the more difficult passages, and her timing wasn't quite as precise as a professionally trained pianist, but something magical was happening. Even though her playing had small imperfections, there was an emotional honesty in her performance that was impossible to ignore. She played like someone who had discovered something precious and wanted to share it with the world. Every note carried the weight of her dreams and the passion she had kept hidden for so long. The wealthy audience, who moments before had been checking their watches and planning early exits, found themselves genuinely listening. The music filled the room with a warmth that was different from the polished perfection they were used to hearing at professional concerts. This was raw and real and deeply moving. As Maria transitioned into the more complex middle section of the piece, her confidence began to grow. The piano responded to her touch like it had been waiting for her all along. She could feel the instrument's power and capability, so much greater than her broken keyboard at home. For the first time in her life, she was playing on an instrument worthy of the music she loved. In the audience, conversations had stopped completely. Phones were lowered. Even the restaurant staff had gathered at the edges of the room to listen. The silver-haired woman in the third row had tears forming in her eyes. The young man next to her was leaning forward, completely absorbed in the performance. Tony stood frozen near the stage, his panic gradually being replaced by amazement. In 3 years of managing this restaurant, he had never seen anything like this. The angry, disappointed crowd had transformed into an audience that was truly engaged with what they were hearing. Maria finished the Nocturne and immediately moved into Debussy's Clair de Lune, another piece from Viktor Petrov's program. This time, she played with even more confidence, letting the beautiful melody flow through her fingers like water. The dreamy, flowing music seemed to cast a spell over the entire room. She could sense that something had shifted in the audience. They were no longer watching out of curiosity or politeness. They were listening because they wanted to hear what came next. The music had created a connection between her and these strangers that had nothing to do with money or social status or professional credentials. For Maria, this was the moment she had dreamed about her entire life. Not just playing piano, but sharing music with people who could feel its power. Every hour of practice, every night of dreaming, every moment of wondering what if had led to this single perfect experience. But she wasn't finished yet. The biggest test was still to come. Tony Castellano burst through the kitchen doors looking like he had seen a ghost. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and sweat beads had formed on his forehead despite the restaurant's air conditioning. Maria had never seen their manager look so panicked, not in 3 years of working there. She watched from across the dining room as Tony grabbed the head chef by the shoulder and whispered something urgent in his ear. The chef's face went pale, and he immediately started shaking his head. Whatever Tony was asking, the chef clearly couldn't help with it. Maria continued clearing plates from table 12, but her attention was completely focused on the drama unfolding in the kitchen doorway. Tony was now on his phone again, pacing back and forth while speaking in rapid, hushed tones. She caught fragments of his conversation as she moved closer. "What do you mean he's in the hospital?" Tony was saying into his phone. "This is impossible. We have 200 people here expecting a concert." Maria's heart skipped a beat. The hospital? Was someone hurt? She pretended to arrange glasses on her tray while straining to hear more. "Food poisoning?" Tony's voice cracked slightly. "How bad? When will he be released?" Now Maria understood. Viktor Petrov, the famous pianist who was supposed to perform tonight, wasn't coming. He was sick in the hospital. Her eyes automatically went to the beautiful grand piano sitting empty on the stage, and suddenly everything made sense. Tony ended his call and immediately dialed another number. Maria could see him scrolling through his contacts desperately, calling one person after another. Each conversation seemed to end in disappointment. She heard him mention money, offering to pay double, triple, anything to find a replacement pianist at the last minute on a Saturday night. The wealthy guests continued their conversations, completely unaware of the crisis developing behind the scenes. They were finishing their expensive dinners and beginning to look toward the stage expectantly. Some had already moved their chairs for a better view of where the concert would happen. Maria felt a strange flutter in her stomach. Without really thinking about it, her fingers began moving against her serving tray, pressing imaginary piano keys. It was something she did when she was nervous or thinking about music. Her hands would automatically start playing songs in the air, muscle memory from all those hours practicing on her broken keyboard. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering to the piano. She knew she could play everything on Viktor Petrov's program tonight. She had studied his repertoire obsessively, watching videos of his performances and learning his arrangements note by note. On her cheap keyboard at home, she had played those same pieces hundreds of times. But that was different. Playing alone in her tiny apartment with broken keys and bad sound was nothing like performing on a concert grand piano in front of 200 influential people. These weren't ordinary music lovers who might forgive a mistake or two. These were people who expected perfection, who paid thousands of dollars for tickets to hear world-class musicians. Tony was now talking to the event organizer, an elegant woman in her 60s who had organized this charity gala for the past 15 years. Maria watched the woman's face change from confusion to horror as Tony explained the situation. This event was supposed to raise money for children's music programs. Without the promised entertainment, donations would surely suffer. The event organizer immediately began making her own phone calls, trying to find any professional musician who might be available. But it was Saturday night, and every good pianist in the city was either already performing somewhere else or unreachable. Maria overheard one conversation where someone suggested just canceling the musical portion of the evening, but the organizer rejected that idea immediately. The program had been advertised for months. People had specifically come tonight expecting to hear Viktor Petrov perform. Some guests had even flown in from other cities just for this event. As Maria moved between tables, she noticed that some guests were beginning to sense something was wrong. People started checking their watches and whispering to each other. A few were looking toward the stage and asking their companions when the music would begin. Tony appeared in the dining room and walked to the microphone on stage. Maria's heart pounded as she watched him clear his throat and prepare to address the crowd. This was it. He was going to tell everyone that there would be no concert tonight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tony began, his voice slightly shaky, "I regret to inform you that due to an unexpected medical emergency, Mr. Viktor Petrov will not be able to perform for us this evening." A wave of disappointed murmurs swept through the room. Maria saw several people reach for their purses and coats, clearly preparing to leave early. The charity organizer looked devastated. After months of planning, her event was falling apart. We are doing everything possible to arrange alternative entertainment, Tony continued, but his words sounded hollow. Everyone could tell he was just buying time with no real solution. Maria felt something stirring inside her chest, a feeling she had never experienced before. It was partly fear, partly excitement, and partly something else she couldn't quite name. Her eyes fixed on the piano bench, and suddenly she could imagine herself sitting there. She could picture her hands on those perfect keys, bringing the silent instrument to life. But who was she kidding? She was just a waitress. These people didn't even see her as a real person, let alone a musician. She had no formal training, no credentials, no reputation. Her entire musical education came from watching videos online and practicing on a broken keyboard. Yet the feeling kept growing stronger. She thought about all those nights she had spent learning these exact pieces, all those hours of practice when she should have been sleeping. She thought about her childhood dreams and how music was the one thing that made her feel truly alive. Around her, the disappointed conversations continued. Some guests were already heading toward the exits. Others were asking about refunds. The magical atmosphere of the evening was evaporating quickly. Maria looked at the piano one more time. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't let this evening end in failure. She couldn't let those children's music programs lose their funding because of one sick pianist. And maybe, just maybe, she couldn't let her own dreams stay hidden forever. She began walking toward the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. She needed to take off her apron and wash her hands. She needed a moment to gather her courage before she did something that would either be the bravest or most foolish thing she had ever done. Tony was still on stage, desperately trying to keep the crowd calm while he waited for some miracle solution that wasn't coming. The event organizer sat at a nearby table with her head in her hands, watching 15 years of reputation potentially crumble in one night. Maria reached behind her back and untied her apron strings. Her fellow servers stared at her in confusion. In the middle of service, no waitress ever just stopped working unless there was an emergency. But this was an emergency, Maria realized. Not just for the restaurant or the charity, but for her. She had spent her entire life serving other people's dreams while keeping her own locked away. Tonight, for the first time ever, she was going to serve her own. She folded her apron carefully and set it on the service station. Then she began walking toward the stage, her heart beating so fast she thought it might explode. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't spend the rest of her life wondering, what if? The piano waited for her, silent and majestic, about to become the instrument of her transformation. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 6:30 p.m., and Maria Rodriguez was already exhausted. She had been on her feet for 9 hours straight, running between tables at the Grand Metropolitan restaurant. Her black uniform was slightly wrinkled, and her feet ached in the cheap shoes she wore because she couldn't afford better ones. But tonight was different. Tonight was the biggest event of the year. The Grand Metropolitan wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place where a single dinner could cost more than Maria made in a week. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting sparkles across white marble floors. The tables were set with china so delicate it looked like it might break if you breathed on it too hard. Everything here screamed money and power. Maria wiped down a table for the third time, making sure every wine glass gleamed perfectly. She had learned that rich people noticed everything, even if they pretended not to see the staff. Tonight, the restaurant was hosting its annual charity gala. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's most important people. Senators, judges, business owners who ran companies worth billions, and celebrities whose faces everyone recognized. As Maria arranged the silverware, she watched the first guests arrive through the tall windows. Black cars with drivers pulled up one after another. Women stepped out wearing dresses that probably cost more than Maria's rent for 6 months. Men adjusted expensive watches and straightened ties that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. They walked into the restaurant like they owned the world, and in many ways, they did. The charity event was supposed to raise money for music programs in poor schools. Maria found this ironic since she had grown up in exactly the kind of neighborhood these programs were meant to help. While these wealthy people would write checks tonight to feel good about themselves, She had lived the reality of what it meant to want something beautiful like music, but have no way to afford it. She grabbed a tray of champagne glasses and began moving through the crowd. The conversations around her were a mix of business deals and vacation plans. One man was talking about buying a house in the mountains. A woman near the bar was discussing her daughter's admission to an expensive private school. Another group was debating which country had the best golf courses. Maria had become invisible in these settings. After 3 years of working here, she had learned that wealthy people looked through service staff like they were furniture. She could stand right next to them, and they would discuss private family matters or business secrets as if she wasn't even there. Sometimes she felt like a ghost floating between tables. But Maria had a secret that none of these important people knew about. While they talked about their expensive hobbies and luxury vacations, she was thinking about music, piano music specifically. It had been her passion since childhood, though she had never been able to afford proper lessons. When Maria was 8 years old, her mother had taken her to a community center where an old piano sat in the corner. It was missing some keys and badly out of tune, but Maria had fallen in love with it instantly. She would sneak away whenever she could to press the keys and imagine the beautiful sounds a real piano might make. Her mother worked 2 jobs and could barely afford rent, so piano lessons were impossible. But Maria never stopped dreaming. As she grew older, Maria taught herself to play using videos she found online. She would watch the same clips over and over, memorizing finger positions and trying to understand how the music worked. In her tiny apartment, she had an old electronic keyboard with half the keys broken. She practiced on it every night after work, wearing headphones so she wouldn't disturb her neighbors. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she loved music. It wasn't just a hobby for her. When she played, even on her broken keyboard, she felt like a different person. The stress of work disappeared. The worry about bills faded away. For those few minutes, she wasn't a struggling waitress. She was a musician. Tonight, as Maria moved between tables serving champagne to people who would never know her name, she couldn't help but think about the grand piano sitting on the restaurant's small stage. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway that probably cost more than she would make in her entire lifetime. She had looked at it many times during quiet moments at work, imagining what it would feel like to play something so perfect. The evening's entertainment was supposed to be Viktor Petrov, a famous pianist who regularly performed for wealthy audiences around the world. Maria had seen his picture in the newspaper and read that tickets to his concerts cost hundreds of dollars. She wondered what it would be like to have that kind of talent recognized and celebrated. As more guests arrived, the restaurant filled with the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter. Maria continued serving, invisible as always, but her eyes kept drifting to that piano. She knew every song Viktor Petrov was supposed to play tonight because she had practiced them herself on her broken keyboard. She had studied his style and learned his arrangements, not because she ever thought she would need them, but because she loved the music. The restaurant manager, Tony Castellano, was running around checking every detail. He was a nervous man on regular days, but tonight he was practically vibrating with stress. This event brought in more money for the restaurant than any other night of the year. Everything had to be perfect. Maria noticed Tony checking his phone constantly, which was unusual for him during service. Good managers never let personal business interfere with work, especially on important nights. But as the evening went on, Tony's face grew more worried. He made several phone calls, stepping away from the dining room to talk privately. At 8:15 p.m., just as the main course was being served, Maria saw Tony rush toward the kitchen with panic written across his face. She had never seen him look so scared, not even the time a famous food critic had shown up unexpectedly on a busy Saturday night. Something was wrong, but Maria didn't know what. The guests continued eating and talking, unaware that behind the scenes, their perfect evening was about to fall apart. They had paid good money to be here, and they expected everything to go exactly as planned. Maria balanced her tray and continued serving. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. She had learned to read the signs in this business. When managers panicked, it usually meant trouble for everyone. She just had no idea how much this particular crisis was about to change her life forever. The piano sat silent on its stage, waiting for Viktor Petrov to arrive and bring it to life. But as Maria would soon discover, sometimes the most unexpected people end up in the spotlight, and sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as disasters.